The heat licked at Jeb's face, hotter than any forge he'd ever known. Flames danced where his livelihood had stood just an hour ago, painting the dust-choked ski a furious orange. He gripped the hammer tighter, the worn leather of its handle digging into his palm, the only solid thing left in a world gone to ash. Dust devils swirled around the hooves of the circling riders, each one a dark silhouette against the inferno. Grady the foreman, a man whose eyes held the chill of a winter storm, sat his horse like a statue, watching Jeb's world crumble. 5 years. 5 years Jeb had hammered and sweated, building that smithy, making something from nothing in this unforgiving land. Now, it was nothing again. He'd borrowed from Thorn, the cattle baron, a man whose word was law west of the Pecos. A bad drought, a run of sickness through his stock. Excuses meant nothing to Thorn. Debts had to be paid. And Jeb, with his failing business, was fresh out of coin. He hadn't seen Thorn himself, only Grady, delivering the cold verdict. Jeb knew what it meant. Without the smithy, he had nothing. Less than nothing. He owed Thorn more than he could ever repay. He closed his eyes, the acrid smoke stinging his lungs. He smelled not just burning wood, but the burning embers of his future. The hammer felt heavier now, a useless weight in his hand. Jeb spat on the parched ground, the dust clinging to the spittle before it could even darken the earth. He remembered Thorn's terms, the unspoken threat hanging heavier than the smoke. He was a dead man, walking if he couldn't settle the score. Then, like a mirage in the shimmering heat, a wagon appeared, pulled by a sway-backed mule. The driver, a wizened man with eyes like polished stones, reined in, beside the smoldering ruins. "Heard you had a bit of trouble, friend," the merchant rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across the hardpan. Jeb just stared, numb. What did this peddler want? The merchant chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Thorn's got a long reach, but sometimes a man can find opportunity in ashes." He gestured to the back of his wagon. "Got a proposition for you, Jebediah." "Heard you're unattached." Jeb frowned. He'd been a widower for 3 years, and the grief still clung to him like a shroud. "Got a woman needs a home," the merchant continued, ignoring Jeb's silence. "Name's Ruth. Good woman, but circumstances. I'll give you a goat, a fine milk goat. You marry her, give her a roof. Thorn gets his due in time. Maybe." Jeb's gaze drifted to the back of the wagon, covered with a canvas tarp. A goat? It was a slim chance, a barely there thread to cling to. But the shame, the gnawing shame of bartering for a wife. He looked back at the flames, the black smoke curling into the indifferent ski-free. What choice did he have? Jeb swallowed hard, the grit in his throat mirroring the taste of despair in his mouth. He forced himself to meet the merchant's gaze, then rebuild. He had to provide. Not just for himself, but for Ruth. The thought was a sharp prod, a foreign sensation he didn't quite know how to process. He swung the hammer with a renewed fury, each blow echoing in the stillness of the morning. The rhythmic clang was a release, a way to channel his fear and anger into something tangible. He worked tirelessly, fueled by a desperate need to reclaim his livelihood, to carve out a small space of safety in a world that seemed determined to crush him. The sweat stung his eyes. The muscles in his arms screamed in protest, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The Baron's shadow loomed large, and Jeb knew he was running out of time. He hammered and hammered, the sound a defiant roar against the encroaching darkness. The hammer slipped, glancing off the metal and slamming into Jeb's forearm. He swore, a sharp, involuntary curse that ripped through the morning air. A white-hot pain seared his skin. He dropped the hammer with a clatter, cradling his arm against his chest. A dark bloom of red stained his sleeve. Ruth was there in an instant, her face etched with concern. "Let me see," she said, her voice firm but gentle. She led him back to the cabin, ignoring his protests. He sat heavily on the edge of the bed, his arm throbbing. She fetched water and a clean cloth, carefully cleaning the wound. He hissed as the cool water touched the raw skin. "It's not too deep," she murmured, examining the gash. "But it needs tending." She rummaged in her carpet bag and produced a small jar filled with a dark green salve. "My mother made this," she explained, her voice soft, "for burns and cuts." She applied the salve with feather-light strokes, her touch surprisingly soothing. Jeb watched her, his gaze fixed on her hands as they moved with practiced ease. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected any kindness. She finished bandaging the wound, tying the cloth securely. "There," she said, stepping back. "That should help." She met his gaze, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. She didn't say anything about his temper, or his clumsiness, or the desperation that fueled his reckless work. She simply saw his pain and offered slice. In that moment, Jeb felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. A fragile seed of hope, watered by an unexpected act of grace. He saw beyond the lines of hardship etched on her face, saw a wellspring of strength and compassion. He saw, perhaps for the first time, not just a burden, but a person. The rumble of wagon wheels broke the fragile silence. A battered ranch wagon, pulled by two weary horses, limped into the yard. One wheel was splintered, almost completely detached from the axle. Jeb watched, his injured arm throbbing in time with the approaching vehicle. Ruth stood beside him, her expression unreadable. The wagon stopped abruptly, kicking up a cloud of soot. A young woman climbed down, her face framed by a cascade of auburn curls. Her dress, rebuilt. He had to provide, not just for himself, but for Ruth. The thought was a sharp prod, a foreign sensation he didn't quite know how to process. He swung the hammer with a renewed fury, each blow echoing in the stillness of the morning. The rhythmic clang was a release, a way to channel his fear and anger into something tangible. He worked tirelessly, fueled by a desperate need to reclaim his livelihood, to carve out a small space of safety in a world that seemed determined to crush him. The sweat stung his eyes. The muscles in his arms screamed in protest. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. The Baron's shadow loomed large, and Jeb knew he was running out of time. He hammered and hammered, the sound a defiant roar against the encroaching darkness. The hammer slipped, glancing off the metal and slamming into Jeb's forearm. He swore, a sharp, involuntary curse that ripped through the morning air. A white-hot pain seared his skin. He dropped the hammer with a clatter, cradling his arm against his chest. A dark bloom of red stained his sleeve. Ruth was there in an instant, her face etched with concern. "Let me see," she said, her voice firm but gentle. She led him back to the cabin, ignoring his protests. He sat heavily on the edge of the bed, his arm throbbing. She fetched water and a clean cloth, carefully cleaning the wound. He hissed as the cool water touched the raw skin. "It's not too deep," she murmured, examining the gash. "But it needs tending." She rummaged in her carpet bag and produced a small jar filled with a dark green salve. "My mother made this," she explained, her voice soft, "for burns and cuts." She applied the salve with feather-light strokes, her touch surprisingly soothing. Jeb watched her, his gaze fixed on her hands as they moved with practiced ease. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected any kindness. She finished bandaging the wound, tying the cloth securely. "There," she said, stepping back. "That should help." She met his gaze, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. She didn't say anything about his temper, or his clumsiness, or the desperation that fueled his reckless work. She simply saw his pain and offered slice. In that moment, Jeb felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. A fragile seed of hope, watered by an unexpected act of grace. He saw beyond the lines of hardship etched on her face, saw a wellspring of strength and compassion. He saw, perhaps for the first time, not just a burden, but not just a burden, but a person. The rumble of wagon wheels broke the fragile silence. A battered ranch wagon, pulled by two weary horses, limped into the yard. One wheel was splintered, almost completely detached from the axle fall. Jeb watched, his injured arm throbbing in time with the approaching vehicle. Ruth stood beside him, her expression unreadable. The wagon stopped abruptly, kicking up a cloud of soot. A young woman climbed down, her face framed by a cascade of auburn curls. Her dress, though travel-stained, spoke of wealth and privilege. She surveyed the ruined smithy with undisguised contempt, her gaze lingering on Jeb. "You," she said, her voice sharp and imperious. "You're the blacksmith." Jeb nodded, his jaw tight. He recognized her instantly. Clara Thorne, the Baron's daughter. Her eyes, cold and calculating, flickered over him, then settled on the bandage on his arm. A cruel smile touched her lips. "I need this wheel repaired," she stated, gesturing to the broken wagon, "and I need it done quickly. My father won't be pleased if I'm delayed." Her gaze hardened, focusing on Jeb with a predatory glint. "Especially considering your outstanding debt." She paused, letting the words hang in the air like a threat. "Isn't that right, blacksmith?" Jeb swallowed, the taste of bile rising in his throat. He knew what she was gone with, pressing down, twisting the knife. The broken wheel wasn't just a repair. It was a symbol of his helplessness, a reminder of the Baron's suffocating control. "I'll need time," he rasped, his voice rough. "It's a bad break." Clara Thorne's smile widened, a flash of white teeth against her painted lips. "Time is a luxury you can't afford, blacksmith. My father expects me back at the ranch tonight. I'm offering you a gold piece, more than enough for a quick job." She tossed a glinting coin in the air, catching it with a snap. "But if I'm delayed, well, let's just say the interest on your debt will become uncomfortable." Ruth stepped forward, her presence a quiet defiance. "I can help," she said, her voice steady. All eyes turned to her. "I know a thing or two about wood and iron." Clara raised a skeptical eyebrow, her gaze sweeping over Ruth's worn clothes. "You? A woman? Don't be absurd." But Ruth didn't back down. She picked up a discarded axe, hefting it with surprising ease. "I've mended worse," she said, her eyes meeting Clara's without flinching. "And faster than he can with that arm." She gestured to Jeb's bandaged forearm. The air crackled with unspoken tension. Clara Thorne scoffed, but a flicker of calculation crossed her face. Delaying her father was dangerous, and this woman, however unlikely, offered a solution. "Very well," she conceded, her tone laced with condescension. "But if you botch it, blacksmith pays the price." She tossed the gold piece to Jeb, the coin landing with a dull thud in his calloused hand. Later that day, while Ruth worked on the wagon wheel, the rhythmic clang of hammer against metal echoing through the valley, Jeb walked into town. He needed supplies, but the air felt different. He caught snippets of conversation, hushed whispers that ceased abruptly as he approached. He heard his name, then Ruth's. "Woman," came from nowhere. "Trouble follows her. Heard she was run out of." He ducked into the general store, the bell above the door announcing his arrival. Old Man Hemlock, usually jovial, greeted him with a tight-lipped nod. As Jeb gathered his supplies, he overheard two women whispering behind a stack of flour sacks. "Medicine woman, they say, killed a man with her potions." Jeb's blood ran cold. He paid for his goods and left the store, the whispers clinging to him like burrs. He found Ruth by the wagon, her brow furrowed in concentration as she tightened a bolt. He had to know. "Ruth," he said, his voice rough, "they're saying things in town." He repeated the whispers, the accusations. Ruth's hands stilled. She didn't meet his gaze. "It's true," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I was a traveling healer. A man died after I treated him. They said I poisoned him." She finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. "I fled because I couldn't prove my innocence." The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Jeb stared at her, the accusations swirling in his mind. A poisoner? Was that who he'd taken in? He looked at her hands, calloused and strong, now still. He thought of the way she tended his wound, the gentle touch, the knowledge in her eyes. Could those hands be capable of taking a life? He pushed the doubt aside. He knew Ruth. He'd seen her kindness, her quiet strength. He'd felt her healing touch. "It doesn't matter what they say," he said, his voice firm, surprising even himself. "What matters is what I know." He reached for a hammer, the familiar weight grounding him. "We'll finish this wheel. Together." Ruth looked up, her eyes searching his. A flicker of hope sparked within them. She picked up a small pouch from her satchel, extracting a handful of dried herbs. "This will help bind the wood," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Willow bark and yarrow. Makes a strong poultice." Jeb watched as she expertly mixed the herbs into a paste, the earthy scent filling the air. He realized then that her knowledge wasn't limited to medicine. She understood the wood, the iron, the very bones of the wagon. She wasn't just helping. She was guiding. He saw her value, not just as someone who eased his burden, but as a partner, a collaborator. As they worked side by side, the rhythmic clang of the hammer became a shared language, a silent testament to their growing bond. The sun beat down, baking the dust into a fine powder that coated everything. They were nearing completion, the wheel almost as sturdy as the day it was made. Just as Jeb was about to fit the final iron band, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, growing rapidly larger. Ruth stopped working, her hand instinctively reaching for a small knife concealed beneath her apron. Jeb shielded his eyes, recognizing the lead rider immediately. Baron Thorne. The Baron reined in his horse, the animal snorting and pawing at the ground. He surveyed the repaired wheel with a critical eye, then turned his gaze to Jeb. "Impressive, Blacksmith. But debts remain." His eyes lingered on Ruth, his expression shifting from appraisal to something colder. "And what have we here?" he drawled, dismounting. "A new acquisition?" He circled Ruth slowly, like a predator sizing up its prey. "Tell you what, Blacksmith," he said, his voice oily. "I'm impressed with your helper. I'm short on staff at the ranch. I'll take her. Cook, cleaner, whatever she's good for. In exchange, I'll wipe your slate clean. Every last penny." Jeb's jaw tightened. The offer hung in the air, thick with the promise of freedom from debt. He glanced at Ruth. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a fear he hadn't seen before. He saw the memory of whispers, the shadow of past accusations, etched in the lines around her mouth. He saw the hope that had tentatively bloomed between them, now threatened by Thorne's cruel proposition. For a heartbeat, Jeb wavered. The weight of his debt, the years of grinding labor, pressed down on him. But then he saw the absolute terror in Ruth's eyes, the stark realization that she was once again being bartered, her fate decided by another man. The metallic clang of his hammer striking the iron band echoed through the valley, sharp and decisive. The sound was followed by a silence more profound than any that had come before. He looked Thorne straight in the eye, his gaze unwavering. "She ain't yours to take," Jeb said, his voice low and steady, a rumble of defiance that surprised even him. "Ruth's my wife." Thorne threw back his head, a harsh, grating laugh that echoed across the plains. "Wife? This fugitive? You expect me to believe that, Blacksmith? You think I'm blind?" He spat on the parched earth. I'm not interested in your pathetic charade. I want what she's got. He gestured dismissively at Ruth. That little bag of tricks she carries. The herbs, the poultice. My cattle are dying, Blacksmith, dropping like flies. And she's got the cure. I saw her using it on that nag of yours. That's all I want. The formula. Give it to me and I'll leave you both to rot in this dust bowl. Jeb's grip tightened on the hammer. He'd thought Thorne wanted to own Ruth, to control her. But this was different. He looked at Ruth, a question in his eyes. She understood. A look of dawning horror spread across her face. She hadn't realized the true value of her knowledge, the desperation it could inspire. The cattle were Thorne's lifeblood, his peak power, and she held the key to saving them. Months bled into each other, marked only by the changing angle of the sun and the lengthening shadows it cast across the valley. Jeb's forge sang a different tune now, a song of prosperity. Word had spread like wildfire through the territory. Ruth's remedies, her knowledge of herbs and poultices, were saving cattle. Thorne's ranch, humbled but grudgingly grateful, was just one of many now reliant on her skill. The debt that had hung over Jeb like a storm cloud had dissipated, replaced by a quiet security. Ruth, though, was the one who truly bloomed. She tilled a small patch of earth beside the forge, coaxing life from the arid land. A few scraggly vegetables, some hardy herbs, even a handful of wildflowers pushed their way toward the sun. It was a small splash of color against the brown landscape, a testament to her nurturing spirit. The fear that had haunted her eyes began to recede, replaced by a glimmer of hope, a sense of belonging she hadn't known since she was a child. The whispers, the accusations, the feeling of being an outsider, they still lingered, ghosts of the past, but they were fading, losing their power in the face of genuine respect and quiet admiration. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of furry orange and bruised purple, casting long shadows that stretched across the valley floor. Jeb leaned against the rough-hewn fence of the goat pen, watching the light fade. The goat, a recent addition, bleated softly, a lonely sound that somehow felt comforting in the vast emptiness. Ruth stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Her presence was a quiet anchor, a steady warmth against the encroaching chill of the evening. He glanced at her. The lines around her eyes were still there, etched by hardship, but they seemed softer now, less defined. A faint smile played on her lips as she watched the goat, a creature she'd nursed back to health, with her own hands. It was a small thing, a single animal saved, but it was a symbol of the quiet power she held, a power that extended far beyond the herbs and poultices she brewed. The West remained unforgiving, a land of dust and wind and unrelenting scheming. But amidst the harshness, something had changed. A small act of defiance, a quiet choice for love, had bloomed into something unexpected. Jeb hadn't set out to change the world, only to protect what was his. But in protecting Ruth, he had protected something more. A hidden gift, a wellspring of healing and hope that the world desperately needed. And as the darkness deepened, he knew that sometimes true value lay not in what was seen, but in the hidden gifts we choose to protect.